There's a moment, and I think most people have had one, somewhere in their lives where you watch something unfair happen and you don't do anything about it. You stand there. You calculate the risk. You weigh what it might cost you. And you decide quietly, privately, that it isn't your fight. I have been that person. Most of us have. But I'm telling you this story because of the one time I watched someone else refuse to make that calculation. The one time someone didn't stand there and wait and weigh things. And I want to get it right, because I've been carrying it for almost 3 years now, and some things deserve to be written down before they get soft around the edges and turn into something prettier than what they actually were. This is not a pretty story. It doesn't start pretty. It starts in a waiting room on a station orbiting a gas giant 64 light years from Earth, with a woman sitting alone on a bench while everyone around her pretended she didn't exist. Her name was Mara Osaibansu, 31 years old, environmental biologist, accredited contractor under the Hegemony's Tier 2 labor classification system, which meant she was legal, documented, registered, and by every measure the Hegemony used to assess such things eligible. Eligible for residency. Eligible for integrated housing. Eligible, technically, for partnership registration. The Hegemony didn't use the word marriage. They used formal biological pair bonding contract, which was exactly as romantic as it sounds, and which carried with it about 47 different legal benefits including shared habitat rights, dual citizen classification, and access to the internal trade networks that single-status workers couldn't touch. It wasn't love, it was paperwork. But the paperwork opened doors, and the doors led to a life that looked substantially more livable than what Mara currently had. What Mara currently had was a shared bunk in a 6-person contractor dormitory, a rotating meal assignment at the station commissary, a locker the size of a small refrigerator, and a 3-year employment contract with Hegemony Environmental Sciences that paid well in Hegemony credit, but didn't convert cleanly to anything useful back home. Earth's relationship with Hegemony currency was still, and I say this having watched it play out for a decade, a bureaucratic mess that nobody had bothered to fully untangle. So she was stuck, not technically but functionally. And she had, at some point over the previous 8 months, made the entirely logical decision to explore partnership registration with Hegemony males. I want to explain something here, because I think a lot of people who weren't living off-world during those years don't fully understand what that actually looked like from the inside. The Hegemony, the Voakai Hegemony, to use the full name, was a political confederation of about 14 species, all of them non-human, most of them broadly humanoid in structure, and all of them existing within a social framework that had been evolving for approximately 3,000 years without any human input whatsoever. They had gender. They had pair bonding. They had family units. They had romance in their own way, though it looked strange to human eyes and operated on different timescales and attached to different triggers. What they did not have, as of Mara's arrival, was any meaningful framework for how to think about human females as potential partners. This wasn't hostility. That's the important thing. I want to be very clear about this because it's easy to read "refuse to marry her" and interpret that as cruelty, and it wasn't cruelty. It was something subtler than that, and in some ways harder to fight against. It was a kind of institutional incomprehension, a cultural blind spot that had calcified into assumption. The assumption was this: human females were temporary workers. They were here to fulfill contracts. They were here for 2 years, maybe 3, maybe 5 if they renewed. They were genetically incompatible with most Hegemony species, which the Hegemony tended to use as shorthand for biologically unsuited to permanence. Even though partnership registration didn't require genetic compatibility, you could legally register a pair bond with anyone the Hegemony recognized as sentient. The genetic component was a separate optional biological protocol. But the assumption had gotten ahead of the law. By the time Mara arrived on Station Kethvor, the informal consensus among Volkai males, the dominant species on the station comprising about 60% of the population, was that humans weren't really pair bond material. Not because they were inferior necessarily, just because they were temporary, like renting furniture. Functional, fine, but not the sort of thing you registered. Mara had spent 8 months learning this the hard way. 8 months of carefully arranged introductions through the station's cultural liaison office, which was supposed to help off-world workers navigate social integration. 8 months of conversations that started warmly and ended with polite deflections. 8 months of watching Volkai males, tall, gray-skinned, ridge-skulled, with those layered amber eyes that shifted color in direct light, smile at her and compliment her work ethic and her adaptation to station culture. And then, gently, consistently, exhaustingly, indicate that they were not looking for a permanent partner at this time, or found her classification status insufficiently stable, or once actually said to her face that humans were known to be emotionally volatile in ways that made long-term registration inadvisable. She told me about that last one. We were in the commissary at shift change, and she said it with this particular kind of flatness in her voice that told me she was past the point of being hurt by it and had arrived somewhere quieter and harder. Emotionally volatile, she said. He actually said that. Was he wrong? I said, because I was trying to make her laugh, and she did laugh briefly in that short explosive way you do when something is funny and awful at the same time. I cried for about 40 minutes after, she said, so probably not. I was her neighbor in the dormitory block. My name is Callum Reyes, and I was a structural safety auditor working a 2-year contract with the station's infrastructure division. I want to be upfront that I am not the hero of this story. I wish I were. I wish I could tell you that I was the one who stood up, who changed something, who made the moment happen. But I wasn't. I'm the witness. The guy who was standing at the right angle to see everything clearly. The hero of this story is someone else. But we'll get there. First, I need to tell you what the waiting room looked like. The social integration office on Station Kethvor was on Deck 7, which was where they kept most of the administrative functions for off-world workers. It had a particular smell, slightly chemical, slightly recycled, the way all station air smelled if you got close enough to the vents, and it was lit by the pale blue-white panels that the Volkai preferred, which made everyone in it look slightly unwell. Human skin tones did not photograph well under Volkai standard lighting. We all looked a little gray, a little bloodless, which was fitting, actually, given what the office did to your spirit. Mara had an appointment. A final appointment with the Cultural Liaison Office, because she had exhausted the standard 8-session integration support program, and they were going to assess her case and tell her what her options were. I knew what the options were going to be. I think she knew too. Renew the single status contractor classification, continue as is, or start the paperwork for transfer to a different station where the population mix might be more amenable to cross-species registration. That was the polite version. The real version was, we can't help you, here's a transfer you didn't ask for, good luck. She asked me to come with her, not into the appointment that was private but to the waiting area, just to be there. Which is such a small, human thing to ask for, and which I think tells you everything about where she was emotionally. She just wanted someone to sit with her in the bad place. So I sat with her. The waiting room had 8 seats. 7 of them were occupied when we arrived. Mara and me, plus 3 Volkai males in the tan uniforms of administrative workers, 1 Desi female, small, blue-green, multi-fingered, who kept her eyes on a data pad, and 1 being I didn't recognize whose species I still haven't been able to positively identify, who sat in the corner and hummed very quietly at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. Nobody looked at each other. That was standard waiting room behavior across most species, apparently. Then he walked in. I have tried over the past 3 years to figure out how to describe Sergeant First Class Daniel Okafor without making him sound like a character someone invented. The problem is that he looked like a character someone invented. He was 6'3", built like someone had decided to see how much structural integrity you could pack into a human frame without actually exceeding the load limits. And he walked with the particular kind of controlled ease that you see in people who have spent years learning how to move in environments where moving wrong could get you killed. He was Galactic Defense Force, the human military contingent embedded with Hegemony Fleet Command as part of the bilateral cooperation arrangement that had started about 4 years before this story. GDF soldiers stationed on Hegemony facilities wore a variant of the standard Hegemony Fleet uniform, adapted for human physiology, in the dark charcoal gray of fleet security. They wore their unit insignia on the left shoulder, a small blue-white earth over crossed lightning bolts, and they wore it without apology in places where a lot of humans would have felt the urge to make themselves smaller and less visible. Daniel was not small. Daniel was not invisible. He came in, scanned the room with the automatic habit of someone who has spent too long in tactical environments to ever fully turn it off, registered the seating arrangement, and sat down 2 seats from Mara. He had a datapad. He looked at it for approximately 45 seconds. Then he looked up and noticed Mara's face. I was watching all of this from the seat on her other side, which is why I can tell you what happened with some precision. There was a moment, barely a second, maybe less, where Daniel looked at her face and something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a slight adjustment, the way a person adjusts when they recognize something they've seen before and weren't expecting to see here. He looked at her face, and I think he saw what I'd been seeing for weeks, that particular kind of exhausted dignity. The way a person looks when they've been fighting a quiet, private battle for too long and have run almost completely out of reserves. He looked at his datapad again. Then he put it away. "Long morning," he said. Mara looked at him. She'd perfected the art of the polite non-engagement look. Most humans did after a few months on station, because the Voakai had a lot of social conventions around not initiating unsolicited conversation in formal spaces, and it bled over into how the humans behaved too. We all got a little more contained, a little more careful. But there was something in his voice, direct but not intrusive, curious without being demanding. "Something like that," she said. "Integration office." He glanced at the doors. "Final appointment." He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What are they going to tell you?" She looked at him more fully. "That I'm out of options, probably." "Probably," he said, not dismissively, more like confirming something he'd already suspected. "What's the issue, if you don't mind?" And this is the thing about exhaustion, and the particular kind that she was carrying. Sometimes you tell strangers things you wouldn't tell people you've known for months, just because the stranger hasn't yet accumulated the weight of watching you fail repeatedly. He was fresh. He didn't have the context that made the story humiliating. He was just someone asking a direct question in a waiting room. She told him, not all of it but the shape of it, the partnership registration attempts, the 8 months, the polite deflections, the comment about emotional volatility. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make the small, sympathetic noises that some people make, which always feel a little like they're auditing your pain for reasonableness. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're wrong." "I know," she said. "No, I mean," he paused, reformulated. "I mean they're not just being socially limited. They're making a structural error. Partnership registration under Hegemony Code doesn't require biological compatibility or long-term residency projection. It just requires mutual consent and tier classification above threshold. You're Tier 2. You qualify." "I know I qualify," she said. "That's not." "The problem is perception," he said, "not law." "Yes." So the law can't fix it, but the perception can be changed. Mara looked at him. I was looking at him. The Desi female across the room had stopped looking at her datapad. "What do you mean?" Mara said. And he said something that I have thought about many times since that morning. Something that was both completely simple and, in context, absolutely radical. "I mean, someone has to go first." I want to stop here for a moment, because what you need to understand is that when he said that, nobody knew what he was about to do. I assumed he was making a general philosophical observation. That someone, somewhere, would eventually break through the cultural resistance and normalize the idea of human women as legitimate long-term partners within the hegemony social system. An abstraction, a historical inevitability phrased in the first person. I did not think he was talking about himself in the next 5 minutes. But that's the thing about people who are built a certain way. There's almost no gap between their theory and their action. They don't spend time in the space between believing something is right and doing the thing. They just do the thing. He waited. Her appointment was called. She went in. She was inside for 22 minutes. When she came out, her face was doing that careful, controlled thing where the architecture is perfect, but there's something behind the eyes that tells you the architecture is doing a lot of work. The integration counselor, a senior Voakai administrative official named Dorath Vel, whom I had met once at a contractor orientation and found profoundly uninterested in helping anyone, had apparently told her exactly what I'd predicted. Renewal of single status classification. Option to apply for station transfer in the next cycle. No further action available from the integration office. She sat down next to me. Daniel was still there. He'd waited. "How'd it go?" he said. He said it flat, not as a question. He already knew. "As expected." She was very still. "They offered me a transfer." "Where?" "Sector 9, Davari Station." She paused. "I don't know anyone there." "No," he said, and then, after a breath, "Listen, I have a question, and I want you to understand I'm being completely serious before I ask it because I know how it's going to sound." She turned to look at him. "What's your full name?" "Mara Osebansu." "Mara," he said it like he was checking the fit. "My name is Daniel Akafor. I've been stationed on Kethvor for 14 months. I have another 22 months on my current contract. I am Tier 3 classified under GDF bilateral integration, which makes me dual eligible under hegemony partnership codes." She was very still. "I am asking," he said, "if you will register a pair bond with me." The waiting room was absolutely silent. The 3 Voakai administrative workers were staring. The Desi female had put her datapad completely down. The humming in the corner had stopped. Mara stared at him. "We met 10 minutes ago," she said. 27, he said, "but yes." "You're serious?" "I told you I was going to be serious." You don't know me." "Not well enough for most definitions of this," he said. "But well enough to know that you've been fighting something unfair for 8 months and the people who should have helped you haven't. And I know that the law says you qualify. And I know," he stopped, seemed to be choosing words. "I know that someone has to go first. I said it and I meant it as more than theory." Mara looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "What do you get out of this?" And he said in the most straightforward way imaginable, "Tier 4 access opens up on joint registration, better housing allocation." And he paused, and something shifted slightly in his expression, made it a fraction less formal. "I've been watching how this station treats human workers for 14 months and I'm tired of it. I can do something today. So I'm doing it." Another long silence. "That's not," Mara started and stopped. "I know what it's not," he said, "but it's a start. I need to explain how hegemony partnership registration actually worked in practice. Because what happened next doesn't make sense unless you understand the machinery. You couldn't just walk into the social integration office and say, 'We'd like to register a pair bond.' There was a process, a formal one, with several stages, and the first stage was a declaration of intent, which had to be filed in the presence of a hegemony administrative official and witnessed by at least 2 recognized station residents of non-temporary classification. The declaration had to include both parties' classification tiers, their station residency records, their biological health profiles, hegemony standard, which was a 12-point biometric scan, nothing invasive, and a statement of mutual consent signed in front of the witness parties. It was bureaucratic. It was designed to be thorough. It was also, critically, not designed with the assumption that anyone would try to use it to make a point. Daniel walked back into the social integration office with Mara 3 minutes after they left the waiting room. I followed. I don't know why, exactly, instinct, curiosity, the sense that something significant was happening, and I did not want to be on the wrong side of a wall when it did. The administrative clerk at the front desk was a young Voakai male, pale gray skin, the first ridgeline of cranial structure just beginning to develop, which put him in adolescence by Voakai standards, maybe 25 human equivalent, who looked up from his station with the automated courtesy expression all front desk workers develop regardless of species. Sergeant First Class Daniel Okafor, GDF, Tier 3 Bilateral Integration, Daniel said. I'd like to file a declaration of intent for partnership registration, under Code 74 of the Hegemony Social Integration Compact. The clerk blinked. The automated courtesy expression flickered very slightly. He stopped, recalibrated. A declaration of intent. Yes. With Mara Osebansu, Tier 2 Environmental Labor Contractor, Registered Station Worker, 3 years. Daniel set his credentials datapad on the counter. She qualifies under the compact. I qualify under Bilateral Integration Agreement, subsection 9. We're within the statutory framework. The clerk looked at the datapad, looked at Mara, looked at Daniel, looked back at the datapad. I'll have to get Senior Administrator Dorothvel too. That's fine, Daniel said pleasantly. We'll wait. Dorothvel was, as I said, a Voakai administrative official of the senior classification, which meant he had been doing this job for somewhere between 40 and 60 years, depending on how you counted Voakai career stages. He had a face like a cliff. Not hostile, exactly, just geological. Settled into permanent forms over long periods of pressure. When he came to the front desk and saw the situation, the cliff face did something subtle and complicated. It didn't crack, but there was movement in it. Sergeant Okafor, he said. He knew the name. The GDF presence on the station was small enough that most senior administrators knew the military contingent by name. Dorothvel, Daniel said. He pronounced it correctly, with the proper Voakai tonal stress, which I noticed the senior administrator also notice. You wish to file a declaration of intent? Yes. With he glanced at Mara, with a human female contractor. With Mara Osebansu, Daniel said. Tier 2, registered, qualified under the compact. Dorothvel was quiet for a moment. Sergeant, I wonder if you fully understand the implications of this filing. I do, Daniel said. I've read the compact in full. I can cite the relevant subsections if that's helpful. Another geological pause. This office does not recommend. Does the compact require a recommendation? Daniel said. His voice was perfectly even, not aggressive, not challenging, just asking a precise question about the law. Or does it require only that both parties qualify, file in good faith, and provide witnesses? Dorothvel looked at him for a very long time. Then he looked at Mara. Is this, he seemed to be choosing words carefully. Is this your voluntary intention, Citizen Osebansu? And Mara, who had been very still through all of this, very quiet, doing that thing where a person holds themselves at a slight remove from events they aren't sure they're living through yet, looked at Daniel. Just briefly. 1 second. Then she looked at Dorothea and said, "Yes." The declaration of intent filing took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Not because the paperwork was complicated. It wasn't, particularly. But because Dorothea kept finding reasons to pause, to cross-reference, to check and recheck the bilateral integration agreement's subsections, and I gradually came to understand that he wasn't trying to block the filing. He was making sure it was airtight. He was checking every line because he knew, with the bureaucratic instinct of a 40-year career, that this filing was going to be examined very carefully afterward, and he wanted to make sure nobody could find a technical flaw in it. He was in his way helping, reluctantly, slowly, but helping. I was one of the witnesses. Daniel had asked if I'd serve, because they needed 2 non-temporary residents and I qualified. The other witness was a Voakai construction supervisor named Kethran who happened to be in the office on unrelated business, and who Daniel apparently knew from his work shifts. Kethran looked at the declaration with an unreadable expression, but he signed. When it was filed, Dorothea stamped it with the official seal and handed both parties the confirmation records. He looked at them for a moment. "This is," he started, then stopped, then said in a slightly different tone, less administrative, more personal, "This is unusual." "I know," Daniel said. "There will be questions." "Yes." "From Fleet Command, from the Integration Council, possibly from the Cultural Mediation Office." "Probably." Dorothea looked at him. Something moved in the cliff face again. It might have been, if Voakai expressions translated cleanly enough, a very reluctant form of respect. "The filing is complete," he said, and went back to his office. We walked out into the corridor, the 3 of us, Mara, Daniel, me. Mara was holding her confirmation record in both hands, and looking at it like it was evidence of something she hadn't fully processed yet. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Daniel said. "So we filed a declaration of intent." "Yes." It's not finalized yet. There's still the review period." She looked at him. 45 days. "I know." "During which the Integration Council can challenge it." "They can try," he said. "The filing is sound, I made sure." She stared at him. "When did you read the full Hegemony Social Integration Compact?" "About 4 months ago," he said. "When I started seeing what was happening to human female contractors on the station, I wanted to know what the law actually said versus what people were acting like it said." Another long silence. Mara was looking at him with an expression I couldn't fully decode. "Why?" she said. "Not about the compact, about all of it." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the corridor, at the pale blue-white lighting, the smooth Voakai standard architecture, the distant sound of the station's life support systems cycling through their steady mechanical rhythm. "Because it was wrong," he said, "and I could do something, so." The 45-day review period was not quiet. I'd be overstating it to call it a crisis. It wasn't a crisis. No one was in danger. Nothing physical happened. But within about 48 hours of the declaration of intent filing hitting the Integration Council's administrative queue, the social atmosphere on Station Kethvor changed in ways you could feel if you were paying attention. And I was paying attention. The GDF contingent, about 30 soldiers in total, stationed across 3 different security and liaison functions, was generally quiet about it. They had a culture, military people do, of not discussing things that weren't their business to discuss. But I talked to a few of them, and the consensus was a complicated mixture of respect and wariness. Respect for the boldness of it. Wariness about what it might mean for the bilateral integration arrangement, if Fleet Command decided to make it political. The Voakai community was harder to read, and I want to be precise about this because it's easy to flatten it into they were against it, and that's not quite accurate. The reaction was stratified. Senior administrators, the Dorothel tier, were mostly cautious. They were watching to see how Fleet Command reacted before committing to any position. There was a subset of younger Volkai males, mostly in technical and labor classifications, who seemed genuinely interested in what was happening, not outraged, not opposed, but paying attention in a way that suggested the action had made something visible that they'd previously been able to ignore. And there was a smaller subset, mostly concentrated in the social integration and cultural affairs divisions, who were actively hostile, not in ways they would express directly to anyone's face, but in the particular administrative hostility that shows up as procedural delays and missing paperwork and meetings that get rescheduled 4 times before they happen. Mara was navigating all of this while still reporting to her work shifts every morning. She was a biologist. The station's environmental science division kept running regardless of what was happening in the administrative corridors. She went to work. She did her job. She came home to the dormitory in the evenings, and sometimes she and I would sit in the common area and she would talk, or not talk, depending on what she needed. She and Daniel were seeing each other, meeting for meals, talking, beginning the actual work of knowing each other that the declaration had, in a sense, put before the reality. It was strange to watch. A friendship being built inside the framework of a formal legal action, the personal and the procedural happening simultaneously, neither one quite leading the other. They had dinners in the commissary with the slightly heightened mutual attention of 2 people learning fast out of necessity. She told me once that it felt like taking an exam and studying for it at the same time. "Does it feel wrong?" I asked her. She thought about it. "It feels real, that's what surprised me. I thought it would feel like a transaction, and it does, but it also," she paused. "He asks good questions. He listens like he's actually going to use the answers." "That's rare," I said. "Very," she said. The challenge from the Integration Council came on day 18. Not a rejection. They couldn't reject it outright, because the filing was legally sound, and Dorothel had made sure of that. But a challenge. A formal request for what they called a compatibility assessment review, which was a process theoretically available in any pair bond registration, but which was, according to the compact text, supposed to be reserved for cases where questions of biological incompatibility pose risk of harm to registered parties. Nobody had ever used it for a human Volkai registration before, because nobody had ever filed one. The challenge was, essentially, an improvised obstacle. They were using a legal tool that existed for different purposes and pointing it at the situation and hoping it would slow things down long enough to make Daniel reconsider. Daniel's response was to request that the compatibility assessment be conducted immediately. He walked into the Integration Council hearing, a formal session, 3 council members behind a curved desk in a room with ceilings high enough to make you feel architecturally insignificant. And he was so completely unrattled that I wonder, even now, whether he'd anticipated this specific move and had a response prepared. The compact specifies that a compatibility assessment must demonstrate reasonable grounds for concern about harm to registered parties, he said. "I'd like to see the specific grounds the council is citing." The council chair, Volkai Sr., with the deep cranial ridge structure of significant age, looked at him with that particular Volkai expression that's something like careful. Human Volkai biological incompatibility is a recognized concern under. Biological incompatibility is relevant to the biological protocol, Daniel said, which neither party has applied for. We are registering a standard pair bond contract, not initiating a biological integration. The compact does not require biological compatibility for a standard contract. I'm asking what specific harm the council is asserting. The council chair was quiet. "If the council cannot specify harm," Daniel said, with the same pleasant precision he'd used with Dorothel, Then the compact's threshold for a compatibility review hasn't been met, and I'd like to continue with the standard review timeline. He said it the way you'd say, "I'd like my change, please." Matter of fact, completely without aggression, which was somehow more effective than aggression would have been, because aggression would have given them something to react to. The council withdrew the challenge. Not immediately, there was a procedural pause of 6 days, but they withdrew it. I heard about this secondhand, through the GDF network, which was better connected to hegemony administrative gossip than you'd expect. The word was that the council had consulted with Fleet Command about the bilateral integration agreement, specifically about whether a GDF soldier's partnership registration fell under the personal rights provisions of the bilateral compact, and Fleet Command had said yes, it did, and there was nothing the Integration Council could do about it that wouldn't constitute interference in the bilateral agreement, which would be a diplomatic incident nobody wanted. The Integration Council, after 6 days, withdrew. 27 days left in the review period. On day 30, something shifted. I don't know exactly what caused it, whether it was the withdrawn challenge becoming public knowledge, or whether it was something that had been building slowly and just reached a visible threshold, but the social atmosphere changed again, in a different direction this time. The Cultural Mediation Office, which was a separate body from the Integration Council and technically had no role in pair bond registrations, published a document. They called it an informational brief on cross-species pair bond dynamics under the Hegemony Compact. It was 12 pages long, carefully neutral in tone, and it was essentially a detailed explanation, aimed at Voakai Station residents, of what the compact actually allowed and why human Voakai registrations were legally valid. It was, in other words, the kind of document that gets written when someone in an institution realizes the ship has turned and they need to look like they were steering it. But it also had the effect of making the subject discussable in official channels, which it previously hadn't been. Before the brief, the conversation on the station was happening in commissary corners and dormitory common areas, and the particular sideways way that people on stations talk about things they're not supposed to be talking about. After the brief, it was happening in shift meetings and department briefings, and once in a formal open discussion that the Cultural Mediation Office hosted in one of the larger common rooms on Deck 5. I went to that discussion. Mara didn't, she felt too visible, which was reasonable. Daniel went, in his capacity as a GDF liaison presence. He sat near the back and said almost nothing, which was exactly the right move. About 80 people showed up, mostly Voakai, some Desi, a handful of humans from the contractor population. The Cultural Mediation Office representative, a female Voakai, which I mentioned because that was relatively unusual in the senior administration, opened with a general overview of the compact provisions and invited questions. The questions were honestly fascinating because they weren't hostile mostly, they were confused. The Voakai asking questions genuinely didn't know how to think about this, not because they'd decided it was bad, but because they'd never been given a framework. The assumption had been so settled, so unquestioned, that nobody had examined it. And when someone put the actual law on the table and said, "Look, this is what it says," the assumption started to look thinner than anyone had realized. One Voakai male, maybe 30 years old in human terms, asked what I thought was the most honest question of the evening. He said something like, "We've always said humans were temporary, but what makes someone temporary? Is it biology, or is it just what we decided to believe about them?" The room was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel from the back said quietly, "Good question." Just that. And the Voakai male who'd asked it looked toward him, and something passed between them. Some acknowledgement, human to Voakai, that something had been said that needed to be heard. On day 45, the review period ended. The pair bond registration was finalized. There was no ceremony officially. The hegemony didn't do ceremonies for administrative completions. You received a confirmation transmission, your legal status updated in the station records, and that was that. But there was a dinner. Not organized exactly, it accumulated, the way some things do when they've been building in a community without a formal shape and finally find one. Mara and Daniel were in the commissary because they ate most of their dinners there and people started joining them. The other humans in the contractor dormitory, who'd been following this for 6 weeks with the focused attention of people who understood it, was about more than 2 individuals. Kethran, the Voakai construction supervisor who'd signed as a witness, who came in with 2 colleagues and nodded at Daniel and sat down without explanation. A DESI technician named Eshval who worked in Mara's department and had become something like a friend over the previous months. The young Voakai clerk from the integration office front desk, who sat at the edge of the group and looked slightly stunned to be there, but didn't leave. Nobody made speeches, nobody announced anything. People just ate and talked, and the room got noisier than it usually was at that hour. And somewhere in the middle of it, Mara laughed at something Daniel said, actually laughed. The full-body kind, not the short, explosive kind. And it sounded completely different from how she'd sounded in the commissary 8 months ago when she told me about the emotionally volatile comment. I watched Daniel watching her laugh. His expression was something I don't have a word for. Not triumphant, not satisfied exactly. More like someone who has completed something they set out to do and is only now allowing themselves to feel the weight of it. 3 months after the registration, I was transferred off Kethvor. My contract audit was complete, my work was done, and the infrastructure division didn't need me anymore. That's how it works. You're useful and then you're done and then you go. I spent my last week on the station paying attention to everything, the way you do when you know you're leaving. The social integration office had, in the previous 3 months, processed 4 additional cross-species pair bond registrations involving human female contractors. Not all of them were with Voakai males. One was with a DESI. One was with a species called the Korthari who I'd barely encountered during my time there. But all of them had cited the Hegemony Compact provisions in their initial filings, specifically the subsections that Daniel had cited. The language had become, in a way, a template. Something to point at and say, look, this is what the law says, and these 2 people proved it works. The Integration Council had not challenged any of them. Dorathvel, I heard, had processed at least 2 of the filings personally. This is not a story about revolution. The hegemony didn't change overnight. The ambient social calculus that had written off human women as temporary didn't evaporate because one filing succeeded. The assumption was old and deep, and it would take years to genuinely erode, is still taking years as far as I know. But something had shifted. The assumption was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. People could point at it and name it and argue about it. And that is, in the long run, how these things change. Mara was still on Kethvor when I left. She'd converted her contractor classification to a dual-status resident designation, which opened up the integrated housing she'd needed, and which also changed her employment classification to something that couldn't simply end when a contract ended. She was permanent as anyone gets, in the transient, humming, recycled air reality of life on a deep space station. She came to see me off at the transit dock. I'll come back, I said, which might or might not have been true. You will, she said, like it definitely was. She looked different, settled in some way, not because of Daniel exactly, or not only, but because the thing she'd been fighting for 8 months had finally resolved, and the resolution had turned out to be real. Tell me something, I said. What? That day in the waiting room, when he asked you, what did you actually think? She considered this. The dock around us was full of the usual departing transit sounds, cargo being loaded, announcement protocols cycling, the distinctive pressure shift hum of a dock that's about to seal. I thought he was either the bravest person I'd ever met, she said, or the most reckless, and I wasn't sure it mattered which. Which was it? She smiled. Both. It was definitely both. I've thought about Daniel Okafor a lot since leaving Keth-Vor. Not in a hero worship way, I want to be clear about that. He would hate that. He was the most no-nonsense human being I encountered in 3 years of off-world work, and I think the idea of being turned into a parable would make him deeply uncomfortable. But I think about what it takes to do what he did, the specific components of it. He read the law, that's the first thing. He didn't assume he knew what it said. He read it, all of it, months before the situation arose because he'd seen something wrong and he wanted to understand the actual structure of the problem rather than just react to the surface of it. He waited for a specific moment. He didn't make a general statement in a crowded room. He didn't write a letter to the Integration Council. He waited until he was sitting next to a specific person who was at the end of a specific road, and then he offered the thing that would actually help. He asked her, he didn't do it for her. He didn't announce it on her behalf, he asked. And then this is the part that I think about most, he just did it. He didn't ask for guarantees. He didn't wait for conditions to improve. He sat in a waiting room in a space station 64 light years from Earth and he said, clearly and without performance, I can do something today, so I'm doing it. That's it, that's the whole thing. The following is excerpted from the written account submitted by Sergeant First Class Daniel Okafor to the GDF Human Integration Affairs Division, 48 days after the completion of the Pairbond registration, as part of a routine experience report. It has been included in this archive with his permission. I want to be accurate about what I observed on Keth-Vor over 14 months prior to the registration filing, because I think the record should be clear about what was actually happening versus what the official systems were acknowledging. Human female contractors on the station were operating in a legal gray zone that the station administration was aware of and had not addressed. They qualified under the Compact for Partnership registration, which would have given them access to residency stabilization, integrated housing, and dual status classification, all of which are significant quality of life factors for workers on long-term contracts. They qualified. The law said they qualified. The administration knew the law. The block wasn't legal. It was cultural. The informal consensus among Voakai males that human women were temporary, unsuitable, not really worth the registration. That consensus was producing a real material outcome. Women who had every right to pursue permanent residency options were being effectively excluded from them by a social assumption that nobody was challenging, because it was convenient not to. I read the compact in full because I wanted to know exactly where the line was, where the law ended and the assumption began. That line turned out to be very clear. The compact doesn't require biological compatibility for standard registration. It doesn't require long-term residency projection. It requires tier classification above threshold and mutual consent. That's it. Everything else, everything that was being treated as a barrier, was assumption dressed up as fact. I want to be clear that I don't consider myself to have performed an act of exceptional courage. I did a thing the law permitted. I did it with a person who agreed to do it with me, and who had her own reasons that were her own and that I respect. I don't want the record to frame this as me rescuing someone, because that's not what happened, and it would misrepresent both of us. What I would say to any GDF personnel who find themselves in similar situations, and I expect this kind of situation to continue as human presence and hegemony space increases, is this: read the law, find the actual line. And if the line says you can do something that's right and you have a reason to do it, then do it. Don't wait for the cultural consensus to catch up. The cultural consensus doesn't move until someone makes it move. That's all I have to add to the record. SFC Daniel Okafor, GDF Keth-Vor, Bilateral Integration Attachment. I didn't stay in contact with the station the way I intended to. Life accelerates. Distances make communication expensive in time if not in credits, and I had my own contracts and my own complicated off-world existence to manage. But I followed what happened from a distance, through the GDF public communications channels, and through the occasional message from Mara that arrived in the irregular, delayed way that deep space correspondence always does. About 8 months after the registration, the Hegemony Cultural Integration Council, a body senior to the Integration Council on any individual station, published new guidelines on cross-species partnership registration. The guidelines didn't change the compact. The compact was already clear. But the guidelines explicitly addressed the application of the compact to human contractors, specifically named the relevant subsections, and required integration offices across all hegemony stations to provide written information on registration eligibility to all Tier 2 and above off-world workers within 60 days of arrival. It was, as these things go, a modest change. Guidelines, not law, information, not enforcement. But it was the kind of change that happens when something has become impossible to pretend isn't an issue, and the institution decides it would rather shape the conversation than be shaped by it. The Keth-Vor registration was cited in the guidelines. Anonymized, a case from Cycle 7, involving a GDF bilateral integration contractor and a Tier 2 environmental scientist, but cited. People who knew. About a year after I left, I got a message from Mara. It was, by the conventions of deep space correspondence, fairly brief. Bandwidth is not free, but she wrote well, always had, and managed to put the important things in a few sentences. She wrote, "Still here. Station feels different. Not fixed. Nothing ever fixes all the way, but different. Eshval got a registration finalized last month. Kethran's daughter started working on the station. First time a junior female Voakai worker has requested a human male as a formal cultural liaison partner. Small thing, but they're paying attention to it. Daniel's contract renewed. He says he doesn't think that's notable enough to mention, which is why I'm mentioning it. We have a better apartment. The windows face the gas giant. It's extraordinary, Callum. I look at it every morning and I think about how close I came to not being here to look at it. Come back sometime. There's room." I read that message 3 times, the last line especially. There's room. This is the thing about fairness. Real fairness. Not the rhetorical kind, not the abstract kind, but the day-to-day, in the waiting room, do something today kind. It doesn't arrive because the right conditions have been created. It doesn't arrive because the culture has evolved sufficiently, or the institutions have reformed themselves, or the consensus has shifted. It arrives because specific people, in specific moments, decide that they can do something and they do it. It doesn't take an army. It doesn't take a movement, though movements help. It takes someone sitting in a waiting room who reads the law and sees the gap between what the law says and what reality is doing, and decides to close the gap by stepping into it themselves. It takes someone who says, clear and quiet and without performance, I can do something today, so I'm doing it. And then does it.